Okay. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this special Centre for Independent Studies event this evening. A particular welcome to those of you who are our members and supporters. If you're not a CIS member, I hope you've noticed the membership form on your seat. My name is Dr. Jeremy Samet, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Centre. It's my job to welcome our speakers. It's also my job to introduce tonight's topic, which is the possible political implications for Australia of Donald Trump's stunning rise to the US presidency. I want to spend a few minutes setting out why I think the topic is important from the perspective of a public policy think tank like the CIS. 2016, I reckon, was probably the best and worst year for political punditry on record, depending on whether a pundit called correctly or incorrectly the US presidential election. Not only that, but also the UK Brexit referendum and, to a lesser extent, the Australian federal election. Most pundits have egg on their faces, while a tiny minority look like sages for predicting Trump's against the odds victory. We have both kinds of pundits on the panel tonight, and I'll let them do their own mea culpas or crowing as they wish. Whether a pundit picked the result largely depended on whether they picked up ahead of time what has become obvious in the wake of Trump's victory. This is the divide between the establishment political class, aka the elites, and a clearly electorally significant group of disenchanted ordinary voters who have rejected the leadership of establishment elites to the electoral detriment of mainstream parties. What has created these divisions and led to what has been dubbed the crisis in establishment politics? I think that Trump, Brexit, and the re-emergence of One Nation are all examples of the iron law of politics that says politics will always abhor a vacuum. For the last 30 years or so, as political correctness has extended its control across the culture, most elites, irrespective of formal party allegiances, have deemed certain topics unfit for public debate. Most elites have refused to discuss, let alone represent, voter concerns across a range of economic, social and cultural issues, ideas and values, which have been dismissed, to adapt Hillary Clinton's infamous term, as deplorable and worse. The silence of the elites has created a vacuum that new political players have now filled, and thereby won the votes of those who feel strongly about being unrepresented by the political class. This is the vacuum that Donald Trump filled with his brash and often crude campaign promises all the way to the Oval Office. Now, opinions will, of course, vary about the populist revolts against the establishment on issues spanning everything from free trade to free borders, to freedom of speech, to freedom of religion. But whatever you think about those issues, I think it's important to consider the broader ramifications for the health of our democracy and for the capacity of our democratic institutions to deliver the political leadership required to address the national challenges that we face. Political leadership in a democracy ultimately depends on trust between the elected and the electors, trust that's founded on the belief that politicians will faithfully represent the views and interests of voters. When establishment politicians fail to say or do what ordinary voters say or think, that trust breaks down, it diminishes their political credibility and diminishes political capital. In turn, voters become far less likely to listen and follow when establishment figures try to say things or do things that voters may not want to hear but need to hear about things like the budget or tax or health and other entitlements. I think these are pertinent issues for us to consider as Australians at a time when there's a general sense of despair about the inability of successive federal governments to deliver effective national leadership, particularly on economic reform. Hence, the purpose of tonight is to explore the extent to which the populist revolt and the establishment crisis could happen here, or perhaps already has happened here, and what this might mean for our politics and our democracy. I'm therefore delighted that our three speakers thought the topic was important enough to share their insights and wisdom with us tonight. Our first speaker is Tom Switzer. Tom is a Senior Fellow at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre and a presenter at ABC's Radio National. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post and Foreign Affairs, to say nothing of his recent saturation TV appearances as the go-to Australian commentator on the new Trump administration. Tom will be followed by Louise Clegg. Louise is a barrister and occasional opinion writer who is keen on democracy, foundational freedoms and the maintenance of core public institutions. She's practiced widely in the public law field and in recent years has taught undergraduate and postgraduate public law subjects. Our third and final speaker is Ross Cameron. Ross is the former member for Parramatta in the Federal Parliament and has worked in law, business, banking and politics. He's a regular political commentator on Sky News and is the co-host of the Sunday morning Outsiders program. In the wake of last November's US election, Ross was dubbed Trump's biggest Aussie supporter by the media. Tom, Louise and Ross will each speak for approximately 10 minutes. They will then be joined by my colleague, Rebecca Weiser, who has recently joined the CIS as a research associate. Rebecca will lead the discussion with the panel and the questions from the audience. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speakers and invite Tom to lead off.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you all for being here. And what a day to talk about Trump and Australia. For those of you who aren't familiar with the last few hours, the Prime Minister continues to argue that the deal struck between his government and the outgoing Obama administration on refugees is a done deal. But the President, however, begs to differ, taking to Twitter just 2 hours ago, calling it a dumb deal. And this follows a Washington Post exclusive story today that shows that Donald Trump was very upset with Malcolm Turnbull during their 25-minute phone call conversation on Sunday. And among other things, Donald Trump says that Malcolm Turnbull and this deal might mean a new Boston bomber in America, that it might mean, among other things, severing of the ties perhaps. And it doesn't quite go that far, but he clearly in his language made it clear that he would hang up after 25 minutes. And I'm reliably informed that the reason why Donald Trump was in such a bad mood is that he was told that Malcolm Turnbull is one of those liberals. Speaking of liberals, quick time out. I want to congratulate the Centre for Independent Studies. Last year was 40 years, Australia's leading liberal think tank. 1976 it was created, a special year 76, little known fact, it was the bicentennial of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, arguably the greatest document of political freedom. It was also the bicentennial of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the greatest document for economic freedom. And of course in 1976 was the year that the great free market economist Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for Economics. So the fact that the CIS was established in that special year tells you something about freedom. It really resonates. Jeremy mentioned that I'm going to wipe egg off my face, and that's always never pleasant. But I think it's always important that journalists and academics always be held to account. And the reality is virtually all of us, not all, Ross was one of the few exceptions, but most of us were wrong about the Donald. Why was this the case? Well, I think the general consensus right from the outset, if you go back to June, July, when the Donald launched his presidential bid, the consensus was that he was rude, crude, lewd, a bit of a buffoon, who, to put it mildly and politely, was incapable of understatement, erratic, divisive, he lacked a core governing philosophy, and the general consensus was this would unite the Democrats behind a very flawed candidate in Hillary Clinton. It would alienate those important independents in the political centre. It would upset the Hispanic community, the fast-growing demographic group. It would alienate women, especially college-educated Republican women. And moreover, it would divide and splinter the Republican Party and the conservative movement more broadly. This was the overwhelming consensus to which I subscribed. But you have to remember, the party of Reagan was very reluctant to embrace Donald Trump for various reasons. I mean, the party of Reagan over the last 40 years has been about reducing the size and the scope of the federal government, free trade, immigration, an activist engaged foreign policy. Trump is none of those things. In many respects, Trump represents an insurgency populist movement against many of the core tenets of Reaganism. I'll never forget, in late 2015, National Review, Ronald Reagan's favourite magazine, many of you are no doubt familiar with it, edited for a long time by William F. Buckley Jr., the patron saint of American conservatives. It dedicated a special issue, Stop Trump. Extraordinary. You had about 30 to 40 of the finest conservative and neoconservative minds in the United States writing articles on why Trump should not be the GOP candidate. Add to this the electoral arithmetic, demography. Hillary Clinton, for all her flaws, was nevertheless the most experienced political figure, arguably in living memory, perhaps other than George H.W. Bush. Add to this all of those factors, and you can see why the betting markets, the pollsters, the experts, the so-called experts, predicted a Hillary Clinton win. We were wrong. Why? Well, I think the best explanation, this is probably one of the few times that people like us can ever praise the fellow, but Michael Moore, the left-wing movie documentary maker, I thought had it best in the months leading up to last November's election. He said that Trump was resonating with a lot of working class folks, uneducated mainly, from Rust Belt states, deindustrialised towns, from states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Many of these states hadn't voted Republican since the Reagan era. And Trump, according to Michael Moore, was resonating these folks because he stood up to globalisation and Wall Street and the big corporate banks. And he railed against identity and political correctness that had poisoned the Democratic Party. And although a lot of these folks didn't particularly like Trump, they nevertheless saw him as a human version of a Molotov cocktail that they could throw into the system in Washington and smash the system. And the reality is, although Donald Trump lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, he won pretty convincingly in the electoral college votes, which is what counts in the American system. And he won over those so-called Brexit states that Michael Moore identified. I think another reason why people like me were horribly wrong about Donald Trump, and I say this about academics and journalists especially, is that we all too often live in a bubble. I think that it's very easy for us to float around and not even mix with a Donald Trump supporter, or a Marine Le Pen supporter, or even a Nigel Farage supporter, or a Pauline Hanson supporter. This is certainly the case with a lot of my colleagues at university and in journalism. I'll never forget the day of the election, spending the day at Channel 7 and then going to the ABC that night and seeing all my colleagues in radio and television staying away from sharp objects. And I said, you guys have to be dispassionate about this. You've got to report it as it is. But of course, a lot of these journalists just could not come to grips with the fact that a Donald Trump resonated with so many people who are fed up with globalisation, or at least blame globalisation. I think they're more likely to be right to blame technology, but they're blaming globalisation for displaced jobs and wage stagnation and income inequality. They're blaming political correctness. They're blaming open borders. And I think all too often journalists and academics, folks you often watch on television, we do live in a bubble. And the episode reminded me of something that Pauline Kael, the New Yorker film critic, something she said after Richard Nixon's landslide election victory in 1972. He beat George McGovern 49 out of 50 states. He won 60% of the vote. Pauline Kael, a quintessential metropolitan sophisticate from Manhattan, she looked at her colleagues the next day and said, "How could this be? I don't know anyone who voted for Richard Nixon." Finally, I think it's worth just concluding before we go to the next panel. Can a Donald Trump-like figure resonate in Australia? I'd say a few points. One, I think Donald Trump himself is peculiarly an American phenomenon, and we can talk about this in Q&A. I think America, the broad cross-section of the American people, are in a foul mood. 60 to 70% of the American people, according to all the available polling evidence, think that the country is heading in the wrong direction, and these polls precede President Obama. So they go back to the Iraq War or 2004, 2005. But I do think that he's clearly, or Trumpism, if you like, has resonated in many parts of Europe, especially in France, and we'll know in a few months' time whether the Trump-like figure Marine Le Pen wins, and it's conceivable she could win. But whether a Trump-like figure in Australia resonates, I have my doubts for two reasons. One, unlike the United States and Europe, we've had 25 years of continuous economic growth. We haven't had a recession in a quarter of a century. We've had real wage growth throughout much of that period. It's tapering off now. But there's been, all things considered, a robust economy for that 25-year period. You haven't had that in Europe, and you haven't had that in America. So that's one point. Second point, as controversial as our border protection policies are, I would argue they help boost public confidence in a large-scale, non-discriminatory immigration system. And that confidence is obviously lacking in many parts of Europe and indeed in the United States. And so sluggish economy and poor immigration controls, I would argue, are the two principal reasons why we've seen the proliferation of a Trump and Trump-like movements across Europe and America. I'm doubtful that it could happen here, although if our economy does go into recession and if we somehow lose control of our borders, and moreover, if political correctness continues to foul the academies and the broader culture generally, circumstances could change. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Tonight I have been charged by our hosts with trying to explain, and I quote, why the political, media, legal and academic elite don't get it, which I took to mean the Australian political elite, really. It's a very good question. Given that I have spent almost half of my entire nearly 50 years living in what Hillary would call hardcore deplorables territory, and the other half of it living and working amongst so-called elites in Phillip Street, in the CBD, and living in the Principality of Wentworth, I suppose I'm as well qualified as anyone to proffer an answer. It's also possible I'm confused, but here goes. If I had to give a one-word answer as to why the elite don't get it, don't get Trump or Brexit for that matter, it would be values. Bill Clinton's 1992 adage that it's the economy stupid, or the Australian variation, it's all about the hip pocket, is still being rolled out. My co-panellist almost just did it, even post-Trump, by politicians and commentators. Little wonder it's proved a very useful axiom to justify pork barrelling around election time. Yes, economic circumstances can and will determine the outcome of an election. We should never write off the hip pocket. But it is misguided, I think, going forward, to think that it's all about money. Middle England knew that there might be a cost to getting out of the EU, but they wanted to get out anyway. They wanted their country back. They wanted to reclaim their institutions, and they were prepared to pay for it. No, there's a new game in town, I think, and it's not just the economy, stupid, it's values. That's why the elite don't get it. It's a case of fundamentally different values and priorities driven in huge part by where people live, how they spend their time at work and play, and that ultimately is the thing that drives our worldviews. Those worldviews have been really diverging, I believe, in the last decade or so. When I put this to a senior Liberal last weekend, he said, well, there's always been a difference between the outer suburbs and the regions and the rest. True, but I don't agree with the suggestion that there's nothing particularly new going on. Big slabs of the media, politics on both sides, the academy, which has been off the reservation for a long time, the professions, at least in the CBD, and let's say it, some in big business, are now so far removed from the worldviews of ordinary people, their fellow citizens, whether in the UK, USA or here in Australia, that it's true. They just don't get it. If we're in the business of looking into a crystal ball, we need to understand what is driving the disruption. We know that many who voted for Trump neither liked nor admired him. But it doesn't matter. If not Trump, it would have been someone else in time, I believe. But on this occasion, Trump won not because it was him, but because he was up against Hillary, the most obscenely establishment person to have ever run for the office of president. At its simplest, Trump is the manifestation of the rejection by a lot of clear-thinking, common-sense people of politics as usual, and Hillary was the embodiment of politics as usual. I'm not obviously the first to say that. Why are the people, but not so much the establishment, rejecting politics as usual? Is it the spin, the broken promises, the talking points and slogans, the leaking, the annual entitlements rorts, the designer gear, the white cars? I hear a hard head in my ear. Louise, this is politics. Politicians have long been on the nose. They've been spinning for millennia. John Howard lost a few ministers to travel rorts in his first term, and white cars have been around for decades. That is true, but it's worse because the behaviour is worse on both sides. The lack of respect for the office of Prime Minister, 5 in 7 years, the appalling treatment of Prime Ministers while in office and then when they leave office. The now accepted idea that we in Australia are in perpetual campaign mode. The obsession with polls and polling, the abject lack of courage and authenticity, the obscene increase in the numbers of advisors and their influence, and the pervasive impact or influence of vested interests. No one likes any of this, but ordinary people hate it more because it does not accord with the way they live their lives. I can expand upon that in Q&A if you like, if you want an explanation. Add to this the values problem. Identity, outrage and victim politics has been embraced by Labor and a number of progressive Liberals in a pretty big way. Many ordinary Australians think it is inappropriate, to say the least, that we are teaching kids in schools that it is perfectly normal to think you might be a boy if you're a girl, or vice versa. Or that it's perfectly standard to be sexually active with multiple partners in your early teens. They shake their heads when students who make a silly, bolshy remark on Facebook or a political cartoonist gets taken to court for being racist. They scratch their heads when a prosecutor who is investigated by a corruption body, for allegedly suggesting how an acquaintance might avoid a breathalyser test, when avoiding breathalyser tests is a national pastime. Who hasn't taken an alternative route home after one drink too many? Not me, but I know a lot of you have. These things are nuts and totally at odds with the common sense values of Middle Australia. Possibly the most defining difference, though, between insiders and outsiders here and around the world, we now know, is their attitudes towards their country. In the suburbs and the regions in Australia, people are proud to be Australian. They love Australia Day and they love Anzac Day even more. They think it is important to vet all immigrants. They don't like immigrants coming here to go on welfare, and they think it's 100% fair for immigrants to integrate. After all, that's what many of them did, and that is what made modern Australia. These are the views of the mainstream right throughout the Western world. Yet, big swathes of those who inhabit and control our institutions, journalists, CEOs, lawyers, Academics and politicians in both major parties think that these attitudes are base and embarrassing. They would not be seen dead waving a flag, and they think the world's problems can be solved by opening all borders. More than that, and this is where it really bites, I believe, and is starting to bite here, many are comfortable, many of these establishment people are quite comfortable with laws or norms that result in their values being imposed on their fellow citizens, via 18C, for example, or via immigrant ghettos in other people's suburbs. They have no problem at all, when it suits them, curtailing the freedoms that our founders did assume that were axiomatic: freedom of speech, of press, fair trial, property rights and religious freedom. They have no problem with those being curtailed in favour of their values. That, I believe, not the economy, was the singular characteristic that propelled Trump. His willingness to take this on in a way that was unprecedented, as Tom has said, that a politician from a mainstream party could simply respond to negative press from the New York Times with #failing New York Times was stunning. Of course, courage, that vital missing ingredient from politics as usual, was easy for Trump because he had absolutely nothing to lose. He was already stupendously wealthy. He was already mocked and pilloried by the establishment prior to even running for president. He had nothing to lose. The big question for us is, can someone outside the mainstream parties emerge as a great new leader? My thesis, and I'm sorry to disappoint the revolutionaries rooting for a cataclysmic Trump event in Australia, is that the Trump phenomenon is already happening here, and in the foreseeable future it's going to be more of the same slow burn, but with an acceleration in the regions and the outer suburbs. Our innate conservatism, despite some people liking Trump and Pauline, for example, but our innate conservatism, compulsory preferential voting, which ain't going anywhere anytime soon, and the monumental physical and human campaign infrastructure required in every House of Reps seat, which I have been directly involved with for 2 campaigns now, that leads me to the conclusion that it's unlikely, at least in the short term. We will get some serious one nation disruption in conservative states, but it won't change things overnight. We will get more Clives, more shooters and fishers, we might get a Corey. Absent the majors coming to their senses, we will get more minority governments and more gridlock in the Senate, which is tragic. What of the major parties? Well, we would do well to remember that the Donald launched himself from within the Republican Party. He was a transplant, a seriously foreign body that nearly got rejected. But he survived and emerged victorious from within a mainstream party. The prospect of one of the major parties in Australia now producing a parliamentary leader who is not put there by backroom deals, who will challenge his or own party room and bring entitlements into line with community expectations and stand up to vested interests, is very remote. Yet this is what is required to restore faith. There's another huge impediment, and that is Westminster. I was reminded recently that Jim Spiegelman used to have a wonderful few lines in his stump speech when he admitted new solicitors to the Supreme Court. It went, "We Australians like to think of this as a young country. Indeed, the second line of our national anthem is that we are young and free, but when it comes to basic mechanisms of government, the rule of law and parliamentary democracy, this is an old country. On that measure, we are older and more evolved than the USA. It also makes us more immune to political disruption. Responsible government is a serious bulwark against populism. The requirement that the head of state, be it a monarch or not, by convention exercises no political power, that the head of government is a member of parliament, that he or she leads the executive council, which is entirely by those who sit in parliament, and is merely a first among equals, that the executive has both individual and collective responsibilities to the parliament and to the cabinet, to each other. These things evolved, not by accident, but over centuries, so that Westminster is a serious break on untrammelled executive or personal power. It is a genius system of ensuring that no individual gets too much ahead of themselves. It is a strength in that it's conducive to stability, no matter what the battering. It is a weakness in that there is a very real practical limit to what leaders can do. Pressure in the system, as we have now, I believe, can only be relieved through elections, which is not that helpful when both major parties are beset by the same structural and cultural problems. It's very hard, therefore, both in theory and practice, for populism to flourish in an Australian context, I believe, other than on the fringes. However, the little bit of Washington that we inherited from the USA, that unrepresentative swill that is the Senate, is at the moment counteracting the stability that is inherent in Westminster. The Senate is now operating in a way entirely removed from what was intended. Governments simply cannot execute their mandates. To be fair to the politicians, this has become such a serious structural impediment that it probably is the number one factor in what is now, without doubt, a crisis in our democracy. I might add, during the convention debates, some of our founders foreshadowed that this would happen. They lost the debate. If I were a revolutionary, I might posture that the Trump machine is about to arrive on our shores, that the establishment is so removed from the people that a great new leader can, must and will save us. But I'm not a revolutionary, partly because history has shown us that revolutions usually end in overreach and tears. And anyway, I personally don't hanker for a Trump in Australia. I want us instead to fix our problems, particularly when the solutions are staring at us in the face. If the two major parties had the slightest motivation to put the national interest above their own, they would embark on bipartisan efforts for sensible constitutional change. It would be amazing what they could achieve if they got together and ran a campaign together. Those changes might be lengthening our parliamentary terms and the mooted Section 57 amendment to enable joint sittings to address parliamentary gridlock. These would provide much needed structural circuit breakers and help governments to govern. The majors also need to embark on genuine initiatives for massive membership drives so they can once again start connecting with real people in real communities. That's going to be hard because at the moment they're not connecting at all with real people in real communities. So going out to the people where I live in Goulburn and trying to get members in will be hard. But they have no choice. They will not survive in the long term, in the very long term, if they don't do it. In New South Wales, where the Liberal Party is at breaking point, unless we give power to the members, real people in real communities, our members and supporters in the regions and the outer suburbs will desert us in droves. We would also do well to do or think about what others have done, give members a say at least, in electing parliamentary leaders. This would reduce the influence of factions, stop the internationally embarrassing leadership changes, but more importantly, invest the parliamentary leader with democratic legitimacy and authority. The crisis in our democracy is of our own making because the major parties, especially since 2007, have been mired in self-interest, self-immolation, and have been out to lunch with everyone but Middle Australia, who wouldn't have time, in any event, for lunch. It has taken two major disruptions on the other side of the world to jolt them, and now they are, as we've all seen it lately, scrambling towards the bush. Whether the animal spirits that have been unleashed by Brexit and Trump will be enough to finally force the necessary structural and cultural change that is urgently needed to make our little big country start to function again is an open question. At the end of the day, though, we are back to the beginning. It is all about values. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to congratulate myself. As Tom says, I feel like we have been somewhat stalking each other. But this is a big day, a very big day. And in many respects, it is a tough day for Australia, even a bleak day for Australia, because I believe that just as Donald Trump ended the political career of Jeb Bush in 3 words, low energy guy, Donald Trump, in all seriousness, in my view, has just ended Malcolm Turnbull's political career in one sentence. That was the worst call so far. Now, my task, besides congratulating myself, is to say, what do I think Trump did right, according to Jeremy's instructions, being the obedient male that I am, and what are its implications for the Australian establishment. And I want to say that there has been this feeling that Trump was, as Tom said, some kind of a buffoon, some sort of a klutz, some guy stumbling into politics who had no idea what he was doing. And I want to tell you that that has never been my view. The most famous encapsulation of the campaign, which I think came from The Atlantic, I should credit the journalist whose name escapes me, is that the media establishment took Trump literally but not seriously, whereas the American people took Trump seriously but not literally. And can I say that I believe, if I'm being absolutely frank, that the Australian people were entirely betrayed by the establishment media in their coverage of Donald Trump and this campaign from the very first day. I believe the performance of the national broadcaster was an absolute disgrace. I believe that that there are basically only 1 or 2 genuine journalists worthy of the title left in the entire empire of Fairfax Media. I believe that, Fairfax Media, its motto in Latin, Warwick Fairfax told me on one occasion, was, "In moderation all our glory. The Tory calls me Whig, and the Whig, he calls me Tory." Well, I can tell you, the Sydney Morning Herald's masthead now, no doubt on the advice of an expensive consultant, reads simply, "Independent, always." Well, I think the Sydney Morning Herald should be sued for misleading and deceptive conduct, because there is no organisation that the relationship between independence and the Sydney Morning Herald is the same proximity as sort of Western Sydney and the far side of the moon. These guys are on a completely different planet. And the losers, okay, for somebody like me, and I suspect many in this room, I mean, I have been a Herald reader essentially since I was old enough to hold an opinion. And the idea of opening the broadsheet, and the smell of the ink on the page, and the power of that masthead in that distinctive font as a journal of record, which was something which bred in me this instinctive kind of respect, a sort of reverence. And I had this sense, Edmund Burke coined the expression the fourth estate as this sort of sacred, one of the great sources of ballast to protect the citizen. And yet what we have seen, you could go from one end of the national broadcaster to the other. You could walk up every one of the sort of 11, 12 floors at Ultimo. You could knock on every single door. You could go into the back rooms of the production staff. You know, I was interviewed by the 7:30 report yesterday. The sound guy, the 7:30 report, unlike Sky, you know, turns up with the interviewer, a sound guy and a camera guy. You know, when Sky News turns up, it's one guy with a camera, a microphone and sound, all three in one. The sound guy says, you know, a bit of chit-chat. I said, oh, yeah, I worked briefly, did some work for the ABC. Oh, yeah. He said, I've worked for the ABC all my life. He said, you know, I've never gone near commercial. He said, in fact, I only watch the ABC. And then he said, you know, I have not seen a television commercial since the Montreal Olympics. Okay, you want to talk about the bubble. You want to know how deep inside the bubble. I mean, this is, Ultimo is basically Pravda 1950s. And what the problem is, okay, the problem is the guy's telling me he hasn't seen a television commercial since the Montreal. He's telling me as if this is a mark of achievement. You know, this is a moment of pride for him that he has not been polluted by the commercial culture. Okay, and so what we've had in the treatment of Donald Trump is just one of this species of sneering, looking down the nose, you know, this. We talk about political correctness. It is a phalanx. It's a phalanx. We've got Tom Switzer here. Tom Switzer, I would say, took Trump's audience seriously, but I will tell you, he was the only academic in the United States Study Centre who did. The only one out of 30. Not a single news and current affairs broadcaster, analyst, commentator in the whole of the national broadcaster in any capital city, radio or television, took Donald Trump's audience seriously. We know the whole of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs was entirely operating on the assumption that Trump was a joke, who had no chance, would be defeated. So the whole sort of organism of Australia's professional diplomatic apparatus was wrapping its arms around tongue-kissing Hillary Clinton on the assumption that she was invincible, obviously could not be beaten. Well, where does that... What we have discovered, there are consequences for that kind of catastrophic misjudgment, and we have just experienced one of them today. As Tom Switzer says, it's not just the consequence of the phone call, it's the briefing beforehand, another one of these Liberals. Now, I'm sure that Steve Bannon would have turned to the great man and said, you're about to talk to the Justin Trudeau of Australia. Okay. That's my sense about the talk, the locker room chat that would have been going on. And, you know, we had a situation where, you know, you finally had the tall timber, this massive edifice of the establishment has just come crashing down. It's a whole new world. Everyone's in a state of shock. And so every significant Australian, you know, Donald Trump went over to the United States in the lead up to the election, didn't even seek to meet. Sorry, Malcolm Turnbull didn't even seek to meet with Donald Trump. But it's all over John Kerry, you know. We love Barack Obama. We can't get enough selfies, you know, with Hillary Clinton. Well, what is the consequence for 24 million Australians, right, who are not in the selfie, okay, who are not part of the establishment, who are exposed to risk? You know, they have got enough problems as it is. Besides, it's not just, the question, could there be a Trump figure in Australia? All right, I think Australians are very tolerant. They're a combination of tolerant and disengaged when it comes to the political class, okay? They basically expect the political class to be self-serving. They basically expect the political class to conduct themselves with low levels of care. They expect the political class to be fairly incompetent. Okay, but when the political class, as we have seen, for example, with these 3 students at the Queensland University of Technology, where you've got an institution of the Australian government which has turned its guns on 3 students and has harassed, has intimidated, has persecuted, has prosecuted them to within an inch of their lives, well, I say they can go to hell. This is what provokes revolt. This is what provokes revolt, when the government actually turns on the citizen and starts attacking them. And I'm going to tell you, if you want to understand Donald Trump, you need to read his book, okay? If you want to understand Julius Caesar, you need to read the Gallic Wars, okay? Because Julius Caesar wrote the book, okay? And he reveals his mind in the book in his own words. If you want to understand Winston Churchill, you should read History of the English-Speaking Peoples. If you want to understand Donald Trump, you should read his book, because while he had the aid of a writer, of a scribbler, there's absolutely no doubt these are the genuine thoughts of the man himself. And in terms of saying what did Donald Trump do right, okay, the first thing was, what he did right was his life before politics was a life outside of politics, okay? And it's a very human story, and it's a story we would all do well to understand. And, things like, his older brother Freddie was actually the better looking one of the 5 kids, who has absolutely smooth edges. Everybody loved Freddie. And Freddie got invited to all the parties, and everyone who met him thought he was a top bloke. But Freddie lacked the fire and the confidence to take on Fred Senior, who was a hard-nosed construction guy who started every day at 6 a.m. on a construction site. And Donald Trump said of his older brother, the older brother was pushed into the business, right? But he never really took to it, in part because he was always intimidated by the father, who was a hard man. And but Donald Trump talks about in the book his own aggression that he had even as a young boy. And on one occasion, he nearly got expelled for punching his music teacher because he formed the view that his music teacher didn't know what he was talking about. And then Donald Trump said he had this revelation that he had to channel his aggression into using his mind to achieve outcomes rather than physically. And he went off to a military academy in high school to learn discipline. He finished up as captain of the baseball team. But he learnt over the course of his life, watching his father, he said, I responded to the business environment and I wasn't intimidated by my father, and I found that as I pushed back, if I disagreed with my father, that he actually respected it. And Trump's 10 points in the art of the deal, if you want to understand his foreign policy, you need to read the 10 points in the art of the deal. One of the points is, he says, if people treat me fairly, I'm the easiest guy in the world to get along with. But he said, if people are unfair or disrespectful towards me on a matter of principle, I fight back. That's the Trump approach, okay, whether you like it or don't like it. He says in the book, as I was growing up, I polarised people. He said, I found there was a group of people who absolutely loved me and would follow me over a cliff, and there are lots of other people who found me a kind of intimidating, disquieting, uncomfortable person, okay? And Trump is saying, I'm used to that. That's my life story. I'm not intimidated by a million protesters. I'm just going to give you, I know I'm already out of time, you're indulging me, but I'm just going to, on matters of substance, okay? Stephen F. Cohen is the Professor of Russian Studies at Princeton University, talking about the way Trump communicates. He said you have to understand Trump communicates in an elliptical way, okay? But you have to look through that to what's in the man's heart. What is he trying to achieve? And one of the things that brought me to Trump is I've been looking at Syria, as we all have, looking at US foreign policy in Syria, looking at Australian foreign policy. And it's just been, to me, completely incoherent throughout the whole Obama administration. If you look at who our co-partners are in Syria, you know, they are the worst grab bag of global terrorists and Islamic extremists that you would ever want to be stuck in a lift with. It is an embarrassment that we are... And then you've got Russia on the other side, okay, fighting Islamic State, Russian Green Berets going deep into Syria, getting killed. So at the time, we're making David Morrison Australian of the Year. He is our military hero. You've got Russian Green Berets deep inside Syria directing the bombing raids on Islamic State, and one of the guys realised he had been compromised by the Islamic State fighters, who realised where he was and what he was doing, and they moved in for the kill from all sides, and his last order was to call in the bombs on his own position. Now that's the Russian idea of valour. Our idea is David Morrison. And we had it wrong. And the whole establishment, the whole foreign policy establishment was just grinding on with this stupid war. If you could distinguish morally between those on the side of Assad and those on the side of the opposition after Al-Qaeda and the lads had moved in, I thought you're kidding yourself. And Donald Trump looked at this and he says, okay, here we go. We've got inside NATO, created at a time when the Berlin Wall was up and the Soviet Union was in place. Okay, so inside NATO, we've got Turkey, who's buying oil from Islamic State, right? Well, we're fighting Russia, whose special forces are getting killed calling bombs in on their own position. Donald Trump is the only guy in the neighbourhood with the humility to ask the simple questions, have we got this right? Why don't we make friends with Russia? Maybe they want to be friends with us. And that was the first, at that point I said, okay, I'm taking Donald Trump seriously, because he is saying the king's got no clothes. And he did it again and again and again. He did it on the wall, he did it on the UN, he did it on education policy, he said we've got to scrap Common Core. He turned around to, you will talk about an outsider. The first question of the first debate, who will take the pledge? Is everyone taking the pledge they won't run against the winner if they don't win? Everybody's one hand goes up. One guy. All the establishment said he's finished. You then had the News Corp hosting the debate. First time in history a presidential candidate looked at the most powerful news network in the world and said, look, oh my God, I don't think I'm going to come. I think you need me more than I need you. That's Donald Trump. The last thing I'm going to tell you is that, I spoke to Janet Albrechtsen yesterday. She just returned from New York. She was talking to a close friend of hers who's quite a senior journalist at the New York Times. And she said, well, they had this discussion, how do you think it's going? And Mary Kessel, she said, you need to understand something. The American economy is on the balls of its feet, ready to go bang. And we've just punched through after, if you read, what was written about the flight of capital that was going to take place. When the United States drops corporate tax from 30% to 15%, can I just tell you, capital is going to move. It's already moving. And we are going to look like, the old pub that never got done up, and there's a few deros out the front, and you walk into the front and it's a mix of beer and urine smell. That is what Australia is going to become. So I say, God bless Donald Trump. There you go.
Thank you so much to all of our panellists, and we'll have a very brief 10-second break while we reorganise the chairs here, and we'll all come back for our discussion. Okay, well, thank you. Just check it. Is my sound right there? Can you hear me at the back?
No, there's no sound. I don't think.
Can you hear me at the back of the room?
No. One sec.
Okay, well, I think you can all agree that was fantastic. Had three very different wonderful expositions. There was some difference, so that will make for an interesting debate. I'll just let you know, so it's about 7:05 now. We are wrapping up at 7:30. I'll try and divide that time equally, so we'll have around about 12 minutes for the panellists' discussion, and then I'll throw it open to you. Ross, I might start with you and ask you, you talked about the elites that took Trump literally but not seriously, and ordinary Americans who took him seriously but not literally. Now that we've seen President Trump in office, do you think perhaps we should take him both literally and seriously?
Look, I watched the inauguration up live late, and everybody was kind of thinking, well, is he now just going to tone it down and turn back in a more conciliatory way towards the establishment, say, okay, well, that's what we had to do to close the deal. Now we're going to behave like a normal politician. Yet what we found was that not only did he not turn, he basically ramped it up a notch. He basically said, okay, now you're used to it, now we're going to really start playing this game. I am loving it. I think it's just getting better and better. You know, I was on Sky last night and some bloke said, oh, we're watching something, this now we see it's probably going to be a train wreck. Okay. Donald Trump has easily carried the argument with the American people, both in relation to the refugee ban and the halt on the 7 countries. The American people are overwhelmingly with him. According to Andrew Bolt, the numbers are 2-1. I think if you could get an accurate reading from people talking to pollsters, it would be probably 2-1. And so long as he's operating from within the consent of the American people. I think he's safe as houses. And I think the more the establishment, crawls into the fetal position and groans and cries and screams out, the stronger his position becomes.
Tom, could I ask you then, if we are to take him seriously and literally, is Trump a protectionist? And if he is, will that be bad for Australia?
Well, I think Daniel Baltz from the Washington Post put it best when he said that the last 2 weeks show that Trump and his record so far means that he's satisfied all his Trump supporters, but he's struck fear into the hearts of all his critics. I mean, he's a very polarising character. But one thing that's clear in the course of the last 2 weeks is that he has put into practice a lot of what he said he'd do, including the executive order on immigration, including winding back or setting the scene for winding back the Obama healthcare provisions, known as Obamacare, the climate regulations, among other things. And one of the first things he did, of course, was withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 12-nation free trade agreement that it covers 12 nations, including Australia. I don't think that's in Australia's interests. And I think that if indeed Donald Trump imposes a 45% tariff on Chinese goods and services, as he said he would do during the course of the campaign, if he imposes a 35% tariff on Mexican goods, I think that will, among other things, increase the prices of goods and services for the very battlers he's ostensibly trying to help. I mean, obviously, textiles, clothing, footwear, for example, at Walmart, the prices will go up because of a tariff increase. So I don't think that's good for his own constituency, but I don't think it's good for economic prosperity for the region and the globe generally. We went down this track in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s when another Republican protectionist president, Herbert Hoover, in the aftermath of the Wall Street collapse, imposed tariffs on foreign imports. And many economists to this day believe that that deepened the Great Recession. So again, another problem is that if you indulge in tariffs and protectionist policies, you're more than likely going to get a response from trade competitors. The economic history shows that trade wars don't lead to prosperity.
I'd ask you then, you talked about the party of Reagan. Reagan, I think Trump's advisor, or Trump's appointment rather, as trade representative was acting in that office in the Reagan era, Robert Lighthizer. And he, of course, was instrumental, and they were instrumental in pushing forward voluntary restraints. Reagan also used tariffs on electronic goods coming from Japan.
Yeah.
Do you think we're seeing there are more similarities there than perhaps those who wrap themselves and say we're the party of Reagan might care to remember?
Well, that's a very good point. I think there is a degree of inconsistency here among conservatives. Reagan on semiconductors with Japan, on certain other industries, wasn't a classic free trader. But nevertheless, I think the broad cross-section of conservatives, and especially Reaganites, do believe in the principles of free trade. But look, one of the lessons we have learnt from this election campaign, and this is a point that Francis Fukuyama, who's been a guest here at the Centre for Independent Studies on several occasions, he wrote this in Foreign Affairs magazine about a year ago. He said that what the rise of Trump and Bernie Sanders, the old 75-year-old socialist who among other things, honeymooned in the Soviet Union, but Trump and Sanders, their rise shows that this is American democracy catching up with 2 generations of wage stagnation and rising income inequality for the losers of globalisation. And they're precisely the folks that Donald Trump has won over.
Louise, if I could turn to you then and ask you, looking in Australia and at populism, we've heard Tom mention Bernie Sanders. Do you think if there's going to be a populist wave in Australia that it might actually be on the Labor side? Are we already seeing Labor adopting more populist positions, and how might that play out?
I think the problem with Labor's populist positions is that they're totally incoherent with their other positions. So they can take some of the Donald's bits on jobs and pretend they're into protectionism, but when they're ignoring the other cultural things, such as free speech, and when they're going for the victim and the outrage, I mean, it's utterly incoherent. Which is why, I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying there's only one seat difference between the parties, so Labor are going to win the next election. I don't think that's obvious at all, actually, because Labor's position is so incoherent. So, look, the only way I see Labor running a populist position is if they reinstalled someone like Mark Latham. Truly. I mean, I think Mark Latham, reinstalled in the Labor Party, could revolutionise it overnight. But I can't see Bill Shorten and Tanya Plibersek and Chris Bowen parting the waters for Mark to come and save them. That's not going to happen. So that's why I just don't think it's going to happen in a mainstream party. The vested interests, the way they are just factionalised, plugged in with people lined up and waiting, there is just, I mean, the career, I think one of the big problems we have, and I didn't go into this in the speech, is the professionalisation of politics. The careerists, none of them, or not many at all, but most of them cannot afford to lose their jobs or lose their seats. So you will find that in all the safe seats across all the major parties, in nearly all cases, my husband's an exception, but in nearly all cases, they will have been pretty plugged into the political process prior to getting pre-selection. Usually they will have been a staffer, on the Labor side a union member, but on both sides. Liberals like to think that they're not like this, but in fact, in the safe seats, and certainly across New South Wales, in the safe seats, they are all career politicians. Now, there's nothing wrong with career politicians, but there are some wonderful people who are career politicians with great values and who do the right thing and behave properly, of course. But the overall system works to eject non-career politicians. They don't like newbies, I can tell you, and that is the problem. So I don't think a mainstream party is looking for a Donald Trump.
Ross, can I ask you? You're such a fan of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What's the one bad thing that you could see that could happen? You've paid a lot of attention. What would be either his Achilles heel, or what's the one thing you fear that he might do?
Well, look, I agree with Tom in relation to trade policy. Okay, I'm a Trump critic, all right? In that I am an Adam Smith guy. I am a Margaret Thatcher person. I am a believer like Paul Johnson, who said if you look back through the sweep of human history, what have been the most positive influences for good on the whole of the human race, he would say that trade is at number one, voluntarily bringing strangers together in trust-based relationships that create value for both sides, maximising the natural strengths of different communities, allowing people's skills to shine. I love it. I will say that one of the reasons why Trump has fueled, I mean, Jeremy talked about the Aristotle thought that, nature abhors a vacuum, so does politics. One of the reasons why Trump has adopted this protectionism is because there's hardly a leader in the free world who's actually an articulate advocate for free trade, including Malcolm Turnbull, so now Angela Merkel, the greatest disaster in Europe since the Second World War, has finally decided, she's finally got a cause to argue for free trade. Okay, well, I will say Angela Merkel is the dumbest leader in Europe. Okay, and she is responsible for permanently weakening because she's a part of this intelligentsia, this sort of class of elites who knows better than everybody else. What was your question? What do I worry about, Donald? What do I worry? Okay. Can I tell you one of my original concerns, one of my secret original concerns,
No longer secret.
was that he had decided that it was good for Trump Inc., whether he won or lost, to run for the presidency. That was one of my original concerns. And one of the 11 points in the art of the deal is manage the downside, and the upside will take care of itself. Trump ran the lowest cost campaign, but had the highest impact, which again was another distinctively Donald thing. On one weekend in which I was in the United States, Donald Trump was on the front cover of 22 national magazines in the United States, and he did not pay 1 cent for the advertising. But right now, Donald Trump, has just sat down with his generals and he said, okay, lads, you've got 30 days to come up with a plan to wipe Islamic State from the face of the earth. Okay, now, do I feel nervous about that? Yes. Okay. Donald Flynn, Killer Flynn, we're going to have these US generals who have been commanding men, tanks, battalions, weapons all over the world, sitting down with Maurice Payne. Okay? Negotiating Australia's participation. They've just put Iran formally on notice. Okay? Iran went ahead. The first test, they've launched a test on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Okay, after the Obama-Iran deal. Okay, so Iran has tested Donald. Okay, so Donald has walked back into the room. He's got his Minister for Defence back in the room and says, Iran, you're on notice formally. I'm telling you right now. After he's just sacked his stupid acting Attorney General, who gormlessly walks into the room. I'm not going to do what you say, Donald Trump. Okay, you're fired. Malcolm Turnbull has not fired anyone since he got in the job. Donald Trump has done it in the first sort of 6 days. Bang, you're gone, sister. See you later. Pack up.
Well, now that we're all suitably edgy, I'm going to throw it open to you, our wonderful audience. So if we have any questions, and I think we have people who will race over. The gentleman there with the blue tie. Yes, so that's you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. Paul Nettlebeck is my name. Many of you here would have heard John Howard just before Christmas, and one of his observations was that he hopes that Trump can deliver to the voters who voted for him. But I think the consensus is that, particularly on the trade issue, he's not going to be able to deliver that. Could I have your opinions whether he is going to be able to deliver or not?
Well, bear in mind, cutting the company tax rate from 35 to 15% at first glance doesn't seem like it's going to help a lot of those battlers in those Rust Belt states, but it will stimulate the economy. And taken together with his plans to increase infrastructure spending, which will presumably get Democratic support on Capitol Hill, and if he targets that infrastructure spending in a lot of those Rust Belt areas that are deindustrialised, that may well create enough stimulus to bring back a lot of jobs to that area. But I don't think trade in itself will do that. I think the reality is a lot of those low-wage jobs in China that have left America over the last 15 to 20 years since China's inclusion in the WTO, they're now leaving China and they're going to countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam and Myanmar. So they're not going to come back to the United States. That's just a reality. But nevertheless, he can stimulate the economy and target infrastructure spending in a way that does boost jobs and employment and growth in those electorates.
Look, I'm going to tell you, some will say Ross Cameron was always mad. But I'm going to tell you, again, go back to the art of the deal. It's the Bible, He says, first of all, he says, if I have to think, I might as well think big. Number 2, he says, manage the downside, the upside will look after itself. Number 3, he says, once you've decided on your plan, get the word out. But then number 4, he says, deliver on the promise. Deliver. He says, you can't keep... He says, the reason his father made a fortune, or made the small fortune, which Donald turned into a big fortune, was because he figured out at the time the middle class was growing. The first thing, Donald Trump's father built his first commercial structure at the age of 16. which was a carport. At the time, cars were just becoming a feature of middle-class America in Queens and the Bronx and outside. But then he learnt how to deliver high-quality housing cheaply. And he could sell it as fast as he could make it because it was a good product. And according to Trump, it's still a good product today. Trump is focused on delivering the result. Trump, I believe, is going, when Trump starts rebuilding these dilapidated inner urban cities that have fallen into graffiti and all over the United States, Trump is a builder. Trump is going to clip together a wall across the southern border of the United States like an IKEA bookcase. It's going to make people's heads spin. They're going to go, how the hell did that happen? And, I believe the thing that is going to make the difference, while I'm not with him on trade, the next point in the art of the deal, which you have to understand, is use your leverage. And this was, I believe, part of this is part of the Trump mindset that must be understood. Use your leverage. And I believe he's looked at the Trans-Pacific Partnership and he said, well, this has been negotiated by bonehead Obama's cronies who did the same deal to take a couple of thousand Australian refugees for no reason at all, except he felt like it. And Trump is saying, no. Use your leverage. Yeah. So he's saying, we're going to tear up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, I believe that Donald Trump believes in free trade probably more than I do. He's certainly done more of it than I have done. And I think you're going to see him then come back to the negotiating table and he's going to do better deals. And this was the stupidity of the Turnbull coalition government, which was when we learnt Trump was going to walk away from the TPP, instead of saying, okay, what is the deal we can do with this guy? What are the opportunities this opens up? And Trump's senior guys were saying, his transition team was saying, look, we expect to enhance deals we've already done on a bilateral basis. And the truth is bilateralism has always been more productive than multilateralism. Multilateralism is part of the elite insider consensus, what I call the lanyard-wearing, business class brigade, who cannot resist a conference in Rio, no matter what the subject, the ones who were sort of trampling over the bodies in Barthelon in Paris before, where they'd just been interred from one of the worst acts of Islamic terrorism, trampling over the bodies to get to a conference to try and lower the temperature of the earth. These cowards, Donald Trump is saying, no, let's do a deal. Yeah. Donald Trump's brain is evolved. He's like the most highly evolved organism in doing a deal. That's basically all he knows how to do, is a deal. And so if Australia is smart, the first question, Malcolm Turnbull should have said to Donald Trump is, what deal can we do? Yeah. Donald would be saying, you're talking my language. If he should have said, what can we do? Look, we want to do something for Australian beef producers. If we was going to say, look, I was really disappointed that Australian sugar farmers got left out of the TPP, I'm trying to figure out, is there something we can do for you that will allow our sugar farmers into your market? That would have been an intelligent conversation. The fact that the first conversation we have to have is over 1,200 refugees, which Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull, now presumably who knows next, have been unable to solve, which has absolutely no logic to it whatsoever. When Donald Trump turns to Malcolm and says, well, I look at this deal, I don't see how it's in the interest of the American people. What's the answer to that, Malcolm? Well, obviously it's not.
I'll just say, Louise, did you want to say something?
I don't know what he's going to deliver, so I won't speculate. But what I am worried about is our ability to respond to it because of the structural impediments we have. So where we need legislation to pass to respond, such as the reduction in company tax, we are going to be here stagnant, as Ross said, and that's what I'm worried about, is our ability to deal with it.
Can I just make the point too that bear in mind Trump has very deep disagreements, not just with Barack Obama and the Democrats, but with many members of his own party. And nothing better demonstrates that than the cause of free markets. I mean, on the TPP, the reality is the broad cross-section of the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate supported the TPP, not just because it meant lower tariffs, but because it meant that the United States would be the principal rule setter in the Asia-Pacific in the 21st century, and not China fill the void. And that is, frankly, in our national interest, I think. The other point I'd say is that when you go back to those presidential primaries last year, Donald Trump was the least conservative candidate or the least free market-oriented candidate out of the 17 presidential candidates. And again, nothing demonstrates that more than not just trade, but his position towards welfare entitlement reform. I mean, one of the big pressing issues on Capitol Hill over the last 5 years has been the Tea Party free market wing of the Republican Party wanting to reduce the size and the scope of the federal government, which means reforming entitlements to rein in debt. Trump opposes all those welfare entitlement reforms. So bear that in mind, Ross, before you put him on a pedestal, because he is not a free marketeer and he's not a supporter of small government.
We're almost running out of time. I'll ask right there at the back, gentleman there at the back.
Thank you, James Phillips. I'm very interested in the reaction of the cultural elite to Brexit and to the election of Trump. And from what I've read so far, the two predominant reactions are to demonise the sort of people who would vote for such things and to treat it purely as an economic issue rather than an issue which has substantial cultural component to it. Are there any views of the panel as to the ability of our academies and state-owned media and other parts of the cultural elite to engage in some self-criticism around these issues?
That's a good question. Look, I truly have spent all of my life traipsing between these two worlds. I grew up in far western New South Wales, where everyone's a National Party voter. It's really quite working class, but everyone is conservative socially. My parents are absolutely that. My extended family are there. I went to high school in southwestern Sydney, and then I went to City University, did law, and ended up here. Now I live back in Goulburn. So I have spent my whole life going between those two worlds. And I've always been conscious of the difference. But I've been conscious much more in the last 10 years, pre-Brexit and pre-Trump, I have to say. And the reaction of my friends, my good friends, and colleagues here in Sydney who work in the CBD, to people living in Goulburn, they laugh. They say, "How could you go there?" I mean, they are genuinely snobby about it. I have wonderful colleagues in universities where I've taught here in Sydney and in Canberra. No, they don't get it. And I don't see any evidence of them trying to get it. So I don't want to take up much more time, but a classic example. Yesterday on Facebook, one of my very dear friends who lives in Sydney, who's a left-wing barrister, shared one of Christina Keneally's articles, which was Malcolm, support our values, which of course was her values. And I love Christina. I think she's wonderful. I think she's a gem, and I think she's clever and smart and articulate. But her piece in The Guardian was saying you've got to stand up for our values. And then she said, when I go to the supermarket and the gym and the school, people are coming up to me and they're scared. And I've got to say, I laughed out loud. when I go to Pilates, yes, we have Pilates in Goulburn, and when I go to the supermarket and to Tuck Shop or wherever I go, no one's scared. And our fellow who helps us on the farm said to me a couple of days ago, I hadn't seen him for a while, and he said, and I said, what do you think? And he's the guy who sits on the sort of top rail of the stockyards, and he talks to everyone in Goulburn. So I say, what's happening on the top rail of the stockyards, Jim? And he said, geez, that Trump, he's a scary dude, but geez, I love the way he's giving it to them. I mean,
Louise, and just one final question. Your husband, Angus Taylor, he's a brilliant mind.
oh,
Why isn't he the knight in shining
Security.
armour that's come to save the party?
oh, Michael. Look,
Why don't you let me answer that question?
can I?
I'm told
Can
we've
I
got to
wait?
wind it up. You go
Let
ahead,
me
all
say
right.
one thing. I will say one thing. I reflected. I thought that some cheeky person like you might ask something about that. But the one thing that Angus doesn't have much in common with Donald Trump, I don't think, but he does have something in common, and that is that he is a transplant. He is a foreign body in the Liberal Party, and they have tried to eject him once, and they might try again. So that is the truth of it. But we're in Westminster, as I said. It's very tricky, Everyone, that's the strength of the system, but it's its weakness. So
Can I just quickly make the point, though, following on from the first question? I'll be quick, Rebecca. I think in many respects Australia had a Trump moment in '99 over the Republican referendum. And I make this point because there was a huge divergence of big divergence between the elite opinion and ordinary people on the question of whether we should become a republic or whether we should embrace the politicians' republic. And I was struck, having worked at Fairfax at the time, the overwhelming consensus among all the newspapers and the television stations and all the journalists and intellectuals was that a republic was not only a good thing but an inevitable thing. And the people disagreed. And that was a Trump moment.
The cultural things have got worse, though, since then. Since
Yeah.
1999, I mean, I was a lawyer in Sydney and going out west to parents. The cultural superiority, the sense of superiority amongst the cultural elite is
And has social
very,
media
very strong
exacerbated
now.
that?
I mean, the
Yeah.
total intolerance
Yeah.
for views of ordinary people.
Yeah.
It just strikes me again and again. I see it every day with my interactions in the both worlds.
But the Liberal
both
Party
worlds
has
I live
been
in.
absolutely useless at addressing any of this. It doesn't matter whether you vote Liberal, Labor or Green, you are still going to have a Sydney University Faculty of Arts. I mean, Sydney University Faculty of Arts went out and recruited the world's leading feminist authority on the orgasm. Okay, she's the leader of the operation, right? She's widely published on masturbation, okay? And I thought, very, very appropriate for Sydney University Faculty of the Arts, That's basically what they're all good at, Meanwhile, the Chinese are building 20,000 kilometres of high-speed rail, because their people actually learn some skills. They learn how to think critically.
Well, I think that's a wonderful to draw to a close what's been an extraordinary, I could even say a Trumpian panel tonight. You've trumped all of my expectations anyway. I think it's been wonderful. I will just say in wrapping up that we were so surprised but delighted by the strength of the response. We had to turn a lot of people away tonight, that we're planning to do this again in a couple of months. So watch the CIS website for further details. Trump will be the topic, and there will be more wonderful insights coming from here. So thank you all to all our wonderful panelists. Thank you to you. And please, there are some drinks, I think, in the lobby.
Let's go.